All right, I researched the latest real data on this before writing anything. Windows 10's actual end of support date, the newest Steam and stat counter numbers, the Copilot backlash, and what TUXEDO OS actually is. Here's the script, built on verified information, written exactly the way you asked. Paragraph by paragraph, no headings, no bullet points, just one continuous cinematic narration. Somewhere right now, on a laptop that is only 4 years old, a small red warning is blinking on the screen. And the owner has no idea that this single notification is the opening scene of one of the biggest operating system migrations in modern computing history. They think it's just another update nag. It is not. It is the moment their machine was told, officially, permanently, that it no longer belongs to the future Microsoft has planned, and multiply that one laptop by hundreds of millions scattered across homes, offices, schools, and government desks around the world. And you start to understand why a quiet German hardware company most people had never heard of a year ago is suddenly being mentioned in the same breath as a full-blown user exodus from Windows. Here's the question almost nobody asked loudly enough until it was too late to ignore. What happens when the world's dominant operating system tells a huge percentage of its own users that their hardware is now obsolete? Not because it broke, not because it stopped working, but because a chip inside it doesn't meet a new security requirement nobody asked for. That is exactly what happened when Windows 10 reached its official end of support, and when Windows 11 drew a hard line in the sand around something called TPM 2.0. Machines that ran perfectly fine, machines people had paid for and trusted, were suddenly placed outside the boundary of supported. No more security patches, no more guarantees, just a ticking clock and a forced decision. And that decision is exactly where this story actually begins. Because here's where it gets uncomfortable. This wasn't a small technical footnote buried in a developer blog. The end of Windows 10 support in October 2025 pushed a wave of users toward Linux, particularly those whose hardware didn't meet Windows 11's requirements. Read that again. Not some users were inconvenienced. A wave. An entire population of machines, many of them otherwise completely capable, suddenly stranded on the wrong side of a corporate deadline. And the people sitting behind those machines did not simply shrug and buy new hardware the way the plan probably assumed they would. Many of them started asking a much more dangerous question for Microsoft. Do I actually need to stay in this ecosystem at all? This is where the story stops being about one operating system update and starts becoming something much bigger. A slow-motion trust collapse that had been building for years before this deadline even hit. Because the hardware requirement was never really the root cause. It was the spark that landed on a pile of frustration that had already been accumulating, quietly, update after update, complaint after complaint, for a long time. What most people are not seeing, because it happened gradually across dozens of small decisions rather than one dramatic announcement, is that Microsoft spent the last 2 years aggressively rewriting what Windows is supposed to be. And a huge number of its own users never agreed to that rewrite. The company's strategy was simple on paper. Take an AI assistant called Copilot and embed it everywhere. Not as an option, as a default, not as a tool you go looking for, as a presence that finds you. The brand spread quickly across the operating system. Copilot got its own taskbar icon, it was woven into the Edge browser, and over time it was built into core system settings, inbox apps, and experimental features that Microsoft hoped would make Windows feel indispensable. The idea was that if you put the assistant absolutely everywhere, it becomes part of how people simply think about using a computer. But here's the twist nobody at Microsoft seemed to plan for. In practice, a huge portion of the user base experienced the exact opposite reaction. Instead of feeling helped, they felt cornered. Many users saw these additions as forced integrations that did not solve any real problem they actually had, and complaints piled up around redundant buttons, AI panels that got in the way of normal tasks, and experimental features that were switched on before they were anywhere near ready. This is not a fringe complaint from a handful of power users in a forum nobody reads. This became a mainstream, viral, unavoidable narrative, to the point where a new piece of internet slang was born specifically to describe what Windows had become in the eyes of its critics. People started calling it microslop. Think about what it means for a trillion-dollar company when the loudest cultural shorthand for its flagship product becomes a joke about quality decline. And this is where everything changes, because the backlash did not stay contained to annoyance. It escalated into something with real teeth: privacy fear. Microsoft introduced a feature called Recall, designed to continuously take screenshots of a user's activity so they could later search through their own digital history, like a private surveillance archive of their own life. The reaction was immediate and severe. Concerns about surveillance, data retention, and potential misuse completely overshadowed whatever productivity benefits Microsoft thought it was offering, forcing the company to postpone the broad rollout and rebuild both the technical safeguards and the default behavior of the feature. Inside Microsoft, this became something closer to a warning shot. Not every AI capability the company is technically able to build will be accepted by the people forced to live with it, especially when it touches something as intimate as a permanent record of everything they've ever done on their own screen. Now layer the security angle on top, because this is where the story stops being just about user annoyance and starts becoming an actual operational risk. When Microsoft crammed Copilot into something as basic as the Notepad app, researchers discovered a major security failure that had to be patched. Let that sink in for a second. Notepad, the simplest, most stripped down, most trusted application in the entire Windows ecosystem, a piece of software that has barely changed in decades, became a vector for a serious security vulnerability the moment AI was bolted onto it without enough caution. This is not chaos for the sake of innovation. This is what happens when speed is prioritized over scrutiny, and it left a visible scar on user trust at exactly the moment people were already looking for a reason to question the platform. The damage didn't stay confined to consumers either, and this is the part most casual viewers never even hear about. Inside hospitals, banks, and other regulated industries, the response wasn't annoyance, it was outright rejection. IT directors in sectors like healthcare explained they had to implement group policies to disable Copilot entirely, because they could not allow AI to process sensitive patient information without explicit documented consent and proper auditing. And Microsoft's default-on approach forced them into a reactive scramble just to maintain compliance. Financial institutions hit the same wall. Compliance officers worried about Copilot potentially analyzing sensitive financial data or generating unapproved communications, and the lack of detailed logging about what the AI had actually accessed created audit trail gaps that many organizations simply found unacceptable. So while Microsoft was publicly framing Copilot as the future of computing, entire industries that the company depends on for enterprise revenue were quietly building walls to keep it out. And here is where the picture widens into something genuinely uncomfortable for the world's most valuable software company. This wasn't just a public relations problem anymore. It started showing up in the numbers that actually move markets. Microsoft's own more personal computing division, the segment that includes Windows itself, along with Surface devices and gaming, declined year over year, even while the company's overall revenue stayed strong on the back of cloud services, and Windows OEM revenue only grew modestly. Think about what that really means. The core identity of the company, the operating system that built Microsoft's empire in the first place, was the one part of the business actually losing ground, while everything else carried the weight. By March 2026, the retreat became impossible to hide. Microsoft began stripping Copilot back out of the very places it had spent 2 years forcing it into, introducing administrative tools that let enterprise administrators uninstall the consumer Copilot app on Pro, Enterprise, and Education devices, though only under specific conditions, while internally reworking the controversial recall feature that had triggered so much of the original outrage. Windows leadership openly admitted what users had been saying for over a year, that the operating system had, in their own words, gone off track chasing aggressive AI expansion while basic stability problems were left to fester, even outside competitors piled on. Mozilla publicly stated that rolling back the forced AI integrations was the right move, but argued it was just the latest example of Microsoft going too far without user consent, pointing out that Copilot had been pinned to the taskbar by default and was originally planned to be embedded directly into the Notification Center, the Settings app, and File Explorer, some of the most fundamental surfaces of the entire operating system. When your direct competitors are publicly lecturing you about consent, you have already lost the argument in the court of public opinion. So picture the emotional state of the average Windows user heading into 2026. Their hardware was being declared obsolete by a security requirement. Their operating system was being quietly turned into a sales channel for AI subscriptions and cloud storage upsells. Their privacy was being tested by features they never asked for, and the company building all of this kept telling them, in carefully worded statements, that it was simply being intentional about the rollout, language that increasingly felt less like reassurance and more like a confession. This is the exact emotional and financial pressure point where an alternative becomes not just attractive, but necessary. And this is precisely the moment the Linux ecosystem stopped being a hobbyist curiosity and started behaving like a serious competitor. Here's where the numbers stop being abstract and start telling a story with real momentum behind it. In March 2026, Valve's Steam hardware and software survey recorded Linux crossing 5% of the platform's user base for the very first time, a milestone described as explosive growth that captured nearly all of the share Windows had just lost, while Windows itself showed a contraction tied directly to the end of Windows 10 support and users actively searching for alternatives. 5% might not sound dramatic if you say it quickly, but this is Steam. This is one of the largest gaming platforms on the planet, with tens of millions of active users every single month. A 5% shift on a population that large is not a rounding error. It is millions of real human beings making a deliberate, conscious decision to leave the platform they had used for years. And the deeper you dig into that number, the more deliberate this shift looks. Inside the Windows camp itself, more than a quarter of Windows users on Steam were still running Windows 10 as of March 2026, even though Microsoft had ended official support for it months earlier. And that lingering group shrank by a massive amount in a single month, suggesting that a huge wave of people finally made their move all at once rather than trickling away slowly. This is the signature of a forced decision point, not a gradual trend. People were waiting, holding their ground on hardware they trusted, right up until the deadline made staying put genuinely risky. And then they moved, fast, in a way that shows up clearly in the data. But think about what that really means for where they moved to. Most of those displaced users went to Windows 11, yes, but a meaningful chunk did not. A report from Zorin OS, a Linux distribution specifically built for Windows and macOS switchers, recorded over 1 million downloads in the 2 months immediately following the Windows 10 end-of-life deadline, with 78% of those downloads coming directly from Windows devices. 78%. Read that again. Nearly 4 out of every 5 people downloading this particular Linux distribution in that window were coming straight from a Windows machine, not from some pre-existing Linux community shuffling between distros. This is fresh blood. This is the exact population Microsoft has spent 30 years building its empire around, and they are now actively, visibly, walking out the door. And this is where the story stops being just about frustrated consumers and becomes about infrastructure that most people never think about but depend on every single day. Because while everyone's attention was fixed on the desktop battlefield, Linux had already quietly won a much larger war that almost nobody bothered to cover. Linux powers approximately 77% of web servers globally, with the top 1 million servers showing over 96% Linux usage. All 500 of the world's most powerful supercomputers run on Linux, a streak of complete dominance that has held since 2017. Cloud workloads across major platforms like AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure show roughly 90% Linux usage. This is not chaos. This is strategy that has been playing out for over a decade, mostly invisible to the average user, until the desktop finally started catching up to what the infrastructure had already decided years ago. So here is the uncomfortable truth that most people scrolling past headlines never quite connect. Every time someone searches Google, streams a show on Netflix, sends a message on WhatsApp, or makes an online payment, the infrastructure handling that transaction is almost certainly running on Linux. The developers building the modern internet have already made their choice years ago with almost no public debate. The only question left was whether the desktop, the part of computing that ordinary people actually see and touch every day, would eventually follow the same path the back-end infrastructure had already taken. And in 2026, for the first time in decades, that question stopped sounding theoretical. This is exactly the moment TUXEDO OS walked onto the stage. Not as some scrappy underdog experiment, but as something far more calculated. TUXEDO OS is built and maintained by TUXEDO Computers, a hardware company headquartered in Augsburg, Bavaria, Germany, with a deceptively simple mission. Ship a polished, ready-to-use Linux desktop that works beautifully on the company's own laptops and desktops, and reasonably well on almost any other PC. This is the part most casual coverage gets wrong. This isn't a hobby project cobbled together by enthusiasts in their spare time. It is a hardware and software company building both sides of the experience in tandem, the exact strategy that made companies like Apple so famously sticky with their users, except aimed directly at the population Microsoft was busy alienating. Here's why that combination matters so much more than people realize. TUXEDO OS rests on a rock-solid Ubuntu LTS foundation, paired with a continuously updated KDE Plasma desktop, and a first-party hardware control tool that gives it an almost Apple-like sense of integration rarely seen on the Linux desktop. Think about what that actually solves. For decades, the single biggest argument against switching to Linux was fragmentation. Drivers that didn't quite work, hardware that fought against the operating system instead of cooperating with it, an experience that always felt one update away from breaking. TUXEDO didn't try to convince people that fragmentation was fine. They simply removed it from the equation entirely by controlling both the hardware and the software stack at the same time. And the design choices underneath go even deeper than surface polish. TUXEDO OS completely removes Snap, the controversial package format that Ubuntu ships by default, and that many users have complained about for starting slowly and consuming excessive disk space, replacing it instead with Flatpak alongside traditional packages, a combination widely praised in the Linux community for balancing compatibility with actual performance. This is not a cosmetic difference. This is a company looking directly at the most common technical complaints lodged against modern Linux distributions and surgically removing them before a new user ever has the chance to experience the frustration firsthand. But here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle anyone still loyal to the old assumption that Linux is only for tech experts. The out-of-the-box experience is genuinely impressive, with a configuration that feels harmonious and immediately usable, the system staying highly responsive during daily operations, and a familiar Windows-like taskbar layout that significantly lowers the barrier for users migrating straight from Windows. That last detail is not an accident. It is a calculated psychological decision. The single biggest barrier to switching operating systems has never really been technical capability. It has always been the fear of the unfamiliar, the dread of opening a computer and not knowing where anything is. TUXEDO engineered that fear away by deliberately mimicking the visual muscle memory millions of Windows users already carry in their hands without even thinking about it. Of course, no migration story is ever perfectly clean, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. There is one honest caveat. Some applications still show compatibility quirks under Wayland, the modern display protocol TUXEDO OS uses by default, things like screen color pickers or clipboard behavior, occasionally behaving unpredictably in certain apps. And the company is not immune to failure either. TUXEDO attempted to build a Linux laptop powered around the Snapdragon X1 Elite chip starting in 2024, but ultimately abandoned the project due to driver and compatibility issues, a candid admission that reflects the genuine ongoing struggle the wider Linux ARM ecosystem still faces on emerging hardware platforms. But here's what makes this admission strategically powerful rather than damaging. A company willing to publicly say, "This didn't work," earns a kind of credibility no amount of marketing can buy, especially when it's standing next to a competitor whose own privacy and AI features kept generating headline after headline of backlash. Now widen the lens again, because TUXEDO is just one visible name in a much larger pattern that has been accelerating in plain sight. Zorin OS itself is purpose-built specifically for Windows and Mac OS switchers, offering one-click layout switching to match either operating system's familiar interface, and it alone saw over 1 million downloads in the 2 months following the Windows 10 end-of-life deadline, with the overwhelming majority of those downloads coming from existing Windows devices. And the gaming side of this migration tells an even sharper story about momentum. Linux gaming reached 3.20% of Steam's active user base by November 2025, representing roughly 4.22 million monthly active gamers, a 57% increase year over year driven primarily by the Steam Deck ecosystem and Valve's Proton compatibility layer. 57% growth in a single year is not a niche curiosity climbing slowly. That is a slope that should make any platform holder nervous. And think carefully about what is powering that slope. Because it isn't ideology, it isn't a political statement about open source software. Nearly 90% of Windows games now run on Linux systems through Proton compatibility technology, which means the single biggest historical objection to switching, "I'll lose my games," has quietly stopped being true for the vast majority of people's libraries. The wall that kept casual users locked into Windows for over 2 decades has a door in it now, and that door is getting wider every single month. So follow the money for a second, because this is where the story stops being just a consumer trend and starts looking like a structural shift with real economic weight behind it. The global Linux operating system market reached an estimated $10.73 billion in 2026, up from $9.02 billion the year before, with growth projected to continue at roughly 19% annually through 2029, reaching an estimated $18.07 billion by that point. That is not the growth curve of a fringe hobby. That is the growth curve of an industry that serious investors, serious hardware manufacturers, and serious enterprise IT departments are now actively planning around, not dismissing. And here's the part that should worry Microsoft more than any single Steam percentage point ever could. This erosion isn't just happening among casual home users anymore. It's bleeding directly into the enterprise decision-making rooms that generate the real recurring revenue Microsoft depends on. A recent industry survey found that 32% of IT decision makers had no migration timeline at all for moving off Windows 10, and 18% were actively evaluating alternatives such as Chrome OS Flex or Linux distributions, instead of simply falling in line with the upgrade path Microsoft had laid out for them. Think about what that number represents inside a boardroom. Nearly 1 in 5 organizations responsible for deploying operating systems across entire workforces are not asking, "How fast can we upgrade to Windows 11?" They are asking, do we even need to stay inside this ecosystem at all? But here's where it gets worse for Microsoft. And this is the twist that turns a consumer story into something closer to a structural crisis. The same survey data revealed something Microsoft cannot simply patch its way out of with a software update. Over 60% of users remained on Windows 10 well into the AI pivot era, rejecting forced upgrades largely because of legacy application compatibility and hardware that physically could not meet the new requirements. This is not stubbornness. This is a population trapped between an operating system whose support clock has run out and an upgrade path that either demands new hardware they don't want to buy or delivers an AI-saturated experience they've already watched their peers complain about online for over a year. And this is exactly the pressure point where the future stops being predictable, because two timelines are now running directly toward each other. On one side, Microsoft has publicly promised to be more careful, more intentional, less aggressive with how AI gets pushed onto users going forward, a quiet admission that the strategy of the last 2 years damaged something the company is now scrambling to repair. On the other side, an entire ecosystem of polished, hardware-integrated, Windows-familiar Linux distributions has spent that exact same window proving, update after update, download after download, that the alternative is no longer just viable for enthusiasts. It is viable for your parents, your coworkers, your local small business, running point-of-sale terminals on hardware nobody wants to replace. So where does this actually go from here? Current growth trajectories suggest Linux could reach 6% of global desktop market share by late 2026 if existing trends continue. And trends like this rarely move in a straight, predictable line. They move in shocks, triggered by deadlines, triggered by backlash, triggered by the next privacy scandal, or the next forced feature nobody asked for. There's even active discussion within the European Union around the concept of a sovereign EU Linux operating system for public administrations across member states, a conversation that would have sounded absurd a decade ago and now gets taken seriously in policy circles. Think about what it means when governments start treating operating system independence as a matter of digital sovereignty rather than a technical preference. What happens if Microsoft's promised AI restraint turns out to be temporary? The moment the company's leadership decides the market pressure has cooled enough to push forward again? What happens to the next wave of hardware that ages out of support the moment another security requirement gets raised? What happens when the next privacy controversy lands in an environment where the word microslop already exists, already spreads, already shapes how millions of people talk about the platform before they've even opened the settings app? And what happens to a company whose entire historical dominance was built on the assumption that switching costs were simply too high for ordinary people to ever seriously consider? In a year where switching has never been this familiar, this functional, or this close to painless? Nobody, not Microsoft's own executives, not the analysts tracking these numbers month over month, not the developers building the next Linux release, can say with certainty whether this is the beginning of a permanent realignment in how the world uses computers, or simply the loudest chapter yet in a slower story that has been unfolding quietly for over a decade. What is certain is this: the deadline has already passed. The numbers are already moving. And somewhere right now, on another laptop, that same small red warning is blinking again, and its owner is about to make a decision that, multiplied across millions of people just like them, may already be rewriting what using a computer is going to mean for the next 10 years.